Good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum and briefly to present a friend and colleague who will introduce this evening's distinguished lecturer. My name is Roger Porter, Director of the Mustafar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And this evening's event is the Robert Glauber Endowed Lecture, established through a generous gift by the National Association of Security Dealers, now the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, to honor the transformative leadership of Robert Glauber. We're pleased to have Richard Ketchum, the Chairman and CEO of FINRA, with us this evening. Bob Glauber served as Chairman and CEO of the National Association of Securities Dealers from September of 2001 to September of 2006, a time of great change, challenge, and innovation. When he returned to academia in 2006, the board determined to honor him by endowing this annual lecture. A graduate from Harvard College, he received his doctorate from the Harvard Business School. And his career serves as a model of how one can take the training that they have received and contribute in a wide variety of arenas. In Bob's case, in the worlds of academia, government, and business. For decades, he served as a professor of finance at the Harvard Business School, and his current appointments are at the Kennedy School and the Harvard Law School. His skill and enthusiasm in the classroom remains undiminished to the great benefit of his students. When the stock market crashed in the fall of 1987, he served as executive director of the Brady Commission that examined the causes of the collapse and produced an insightful set of recommendations for policy changes that could help reduce the likelihood and dampen the effects of such patterns in the future. He served as Undersecretary of the Treasury for Finance from 1989 to 1992. And it was during this period of time that I had the opportunity of working closely with him on a wide variety of issues. In the world of business, he has served and continues to serve on a number of corporate boards. I promised I would be brief, and I will keep to that commitment, but before inviting him to introduce our speaker, may I note two things worth your considering. Some of you are contemplating career paths and what the future holds for you. Others of you are already in the midst of them. Whether in the public, private, or not-for-profit sectors, there are certain qualities that are common to success. The first is trust. Can you trust someone's word? Do they keep the commitments that they have made? Do they hide or shade the truth? Do they take shortcuts? The second is how they weigh the imperatives of the present and the future. To what extent do they take into consideration in their advice and in their decisions how those decisions will affect those in the future and not merely the immediate concerns that seem so important? Great organizations, great societies, and great leaders devote at least as much attention to the future as they do to the present. This lecture proudly carries the name of Robert Glauber because he is one whose word could always be trusted and whose decisions were wise because his vision was so long. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Robert Glauber.
Thank you for that far too generous introduction, and that ends that part of the proceedings this evening. I'm here to introduce my friend Mary Shapiro, which gives me just unbelievable delight. Mary is the 29th chairman of the SEC and the first woman to serve as the agency's permanent head. She is, in fact, the third lecturer in this series, which was initiated several years ago. The first two were Chris Cox, who, of course, was her predecessor at the SEC, and Paul Volcker, the retired chairman of the Fed, whose talk was postponed until last month by virtue of some scheduling difficulties first, and then the fact that he became the chairman of the President's Economic Advisory Board. The previous speakers in this series make very clear why Mary is the absolutely most fitting choice that we could have at this point. But as Roger has suggested, there is this other less obvious and somewhat ironic reason, because Mary was CEO and chairman of NASD when it endowed this lecture series. And of course, prior to being CEO and chairman, Mary was my partner and very good friend in running NASD. So I'm particularly happy to have the opportunity to welcome her here this evening. I think for so very many of us, the choice by President Obama to nominate Mary as chairman of the SEC seemed just completely obvious. Her long career has given her simply unrivaled experience in securities markets and financial market regulation. She was a commissioner of the SEC. She was acting chairman of the SEC. Then she was chairman of the CFTC. Then, of course, CEO and chairman of NASD. And finally, CEO of FINRA, Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, which was the successor to the NASD. And as Rogers has said, Rick Ketchum, who is the current chair, CEO, is with us tonight. And thank you very much for coming, Rick. There's a great deal more of Mary's professional history, but I think this gives you a sense of her extraordinary qualifications for what is a most challenging job that she now has. I think to say that the leadership task Mary inherited in January at the SEC was challenging is perhaps something of an understatement. The institution was reeling from public criticism on many fronts: a failure to effectively monitor risk levels at large investment banks, ineffective rules that failed to prevent money market mutual funds from breaking the buck and freezing up during the financial crisis, supervision failures that permitted prolonged, massive frauds at Bernie Madoff's investment advisory firm and the Stanford Financial Group. Such criticism could not have come at a worse time as Congress began debating a far-reaching financial regulatory overhaul. The staff was demoralized, and many feared for the continued existence of the SEC as a separate agency. Mary moved rapidly to buoy morale, and I think it's certainly fair now to say with some confidence, to assure the agency's independent future status. She quickly overhauled the Enforcement Division, appointed a highly respected, tough prosecutor, Rob Kazami, as head, and eliminated an entire level of management, making the division more agile and more responsive. The results have been quick to come. A rapid increase in formal orders, emergency actions, disgorgements, and high-profile settlements, including one announced just today in the Jefferson County, Alabama municipal bond pay-to-play scandal. With money market mutual funds, where the reserve fund broke the buck last fall, the SEC has proposed strengthening credit quality, liquidity, and maturity standards and introduced stress testing to prevent a replay of the Madoff and Stanford investment advisor disgraces. The SEC is overhauling supervision and has put in place rules to assure clients that their accounts really do have money in them when the statements say they have money in them. On other fronts, the SEC has moved to rein in naked short selling, pushed forward rules to make it easier for shareholders to nominate directors, to contest a board slate of nominees, proposed rules that require disclosure to shareholders of more meaningful information about the leadership structure of boards, the qualifications of board nominees, and how compensation policies affect company risk-taking. It's quite an extraordinary record for 9 months on the job. But of course, the need for rapid action was pressing, and Mary's long experience let her hit the road running. I suspect this whirlwind of activity has taken some toll on Mary and on her family, which includes a husband who's an academic, like many of us, 2 lovely young daughters, and several large dogs. But all of us, and I think our financial markets as well, are most fortunate that we've had her on the job, and that she's been willing to throw herself into the work with such vigor. I know all of us are anxious to hear what Mary has to say this evening, and as I said at the outset, for me it is a privilege and a great personal pleasure to introduce my friend, former colleague, Mary Shapiro.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob, for that really lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's really an honor for me to speak this evening at the Glauber Lecture, named, as Roger said, not only for a transformative leader, but for me, a dear friend and colleague. And Bob and I worked together for a number of years at NASD, and recently our paths cross frequently as we both wrestle with the issues of convergence of U.S. and international accounting standards. But I will spare you a detailed dissertation tonight on the convergence of accounting standards. When this lectureship was first established, it was described as a forum at which to discuss topics at the dynamic interface of business and government. And the Kennedy School is the perfect place for that. So many leaders and policymakers have come through this institution, and I'm highly confident that many of tomorrow's leaders are here in this room tonight. Now, as you can imagine, and as Bob has described, the SEC has had a rather full plate over the past 9 months. When President Obama asked me to be his chairman last December, the stock market was still tumbling, Bernard Madoff was fast becoming a household name, and investors were rapidly losing their confidence in our capital markets. I had served at the SEC years earlier, but so much had changed, and the challenges were great. But I believe in the SEC, I believe in the investor protection mission, I believe in government service, and I believe that the reputation of the SEC can be restored to what it once was, a premier regulatory agency within the pantheon of regulators. And I believe American investors deserve no less. And so I decided to take the job. It was a tall order, but I thought I would just apply the many lessons I learned over my career to help guide me through this new challenge, a challenge that entailed reinvigorating the agency, refocusing the SEC on its core mission of investor protection, and rebuilding investor confidence in our markets. So tonight, rather than give a dense policy talk, although those are interesting too, I thought I would share with you, particularly the students who are here with us, a few of the lessons that guide my leadership at the SEC. The first lesson is to recognize errors and missteps and to learn from them. No one in this room will go through life without making a mistake, or frankly, many mistakes. Some of those mistakes will be little, and others will be monumental. When they occur, you have a choice: skulk into obscurity and never rear your head again, or figure out what was done wrong and work to ensure it doesn't happen again. At the SEC, we have a staff of incredibly talented men and women, and we tackle some of the most challenging issues confronting the financial markets. But for the past year, many people judge the SEC not based on what it did, but what it didn't do, namely detect the Madoff fraud. In September, our Inspector General issued a report that outlined many of the shortcomings that allowed this fraud to go undetected over a large number of years. But even before his report was issued, we set out to understand where we could improve. And for the past year, we've been re-examining and reforming the way we operate. Shortly after arriving at the agency, I hired, as Bob said, a new head of our enforcement division, a tough prosecutor, and began restructuring the unit, eliminating a layer of management, putting more seasoned investigators back on the front lines, bolstering our training programs, revamping the way we handle the mounds of tips and complaints we receive, and setting out to expand our considerable expertise through new hires. And by the time the Inspector General's report was issued, we had already had a meaningful head start on the reforms we all agreed needed to be undertaken. But then rather than sticking that report in a drawer, I knew we needed to learn everything we could from it. So I sent it to every one of the 3,700 employees at our agency and encouraged them to read it. And together with that report, I sent along a sampling of the victims' letters, not just for everyone to read about the victims' anger and disappointment, but to remind ourselves about how important it is to do what we do every day, to appreciate the very suffering that our work can prevent. The second lesson is not to assume you know it all. Everyone here, no doubt, entered this institution with a great deal of intelligence, and you will leave with a great deal more knowledge. But no one can ever corner the market on knowledge. There is just too much to know, and there is too much that is unknowable. That is why it's important not to be fearful of reaching out to others. In the policymaking world, we are often called upon to solve problems with little time and insufficient information. At those moments, we need to make the best decisions we can. So that means finding people who are more familiar with the issue than we are, who have experienced the problems firsthand, or who simply have a different perspective. The fact is that not everyone who is a critic is wrong, and not everyone who has a different view is mistaken. At the end of the day, if you're in charge, you need to be able to make the decision, and you should be able to act swiftly in implementing it. But there is nothing wrong, and indeed there is everything right, in first getting diversity of views from those around you. In many ways, the manner in which the SEC creates rules for the industry embraces this very lesson. As a commission, we need to get a majority of the commissioners to agree to a certain proposal, and then the public, the industry, investors, corporations, gatekeepers are asked to comment on what we've proposed. The comment period is perhaps one of the most valuable phases in our rulemaking process because it invites everyone to identify the flaws, and it forces us to rethink what we've just proposed. I don't view it as a mere formality, but as a vital component in the process that makes our rules all the better. Likewise, in the regulatory reform arena, I believe this diversity of views is similarly important. Right now, for instance, there is much focus on the need for establishing a better way to monitor, detect, and respond to systemic risk. And one line of thought is that we need a single entity to do all of this, oversee the entire financial system, identify the risky players, pluck them out of the normal regulatory framework at a moment's notice, and impose new requirements upon them. I do not believe that any one entity can fulfill that role. Perhaps we need one entity to have the authority and the ability to act swiftly, but I believe that entity should not alone be the one to craft the rules by which any risky player must abide. And that's why I support coupling that single systemic risk regulator with a council of regulators, and a diverse one at that. A council composed of regulators with different expertise and different perspectives, a council with diverse experience regulating different types of financial institutions and different products, from equities and futures to options and loans. A council to serve as a second set of eyes for the functional regulators, and that can shape the rules that the systemic risk regulator is charged to implement. Rather than allowing one super regulator to maintain all the control, the council would ensure that there is more than one voice and more than one perspective in monitoring systemic risk. Different people's perspectives, knowledge, and experience can help. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as a Harvard graduate, you shouldn't feel reluctant to accept advice from someone from Yale. Which brings me to my next lesson: the right people make all the difference. This is particularly true at an agency like the SEC, where our product is the policy we make or the cases we bring, and they are both 100% the result of the intellectual capability of our people. If you're going to reach out to those around you to make the best decision you can, then you must ensure that they have what it takes. Do they have the skill set and the experience that are needed, the dedication to do the job, and an understanding of the mission? And in government, as importantly, do you have enough people to tackle the challenges you face? At the SEC, one of the things I've been trying to do is bring on board more people with non-traditional skill sets and backgrounds. We have many attorneys, we have many accountants, and they are absolutely needed for us to succeed. But we also need more people at the cutting edge of finance, We need people who are deeply familiar with derivatives, hedge funds, trading, and risk. That's in part because there are so many new financial products and strategies being developed, and we must keep pace. So we need to have people capable of connecting the dots of multiple risks and regulatory concerns and devising appropriate responses. This September, to address this issue, I created a new division of risk, strategy, and financial innovation to serve as a knowledge-based center of expertise within the agency. Importantly, it's a division that will also help link existing know-how from one part of the agency to the needs of another. And slowly but surely, we're staffing it up. Just today, we announced 3 more hires with modern capital markets expertise. One is a well-known financial expert and noted author. One is an expert in the legal issues surrounding derivatives and structured products. And the third is an expert in hedge funds. But to make all this work, we have to have the resources to hire the people we need, and that has been a huge challenge for us as well. Investors expect that the agency looking out for them can perform the task we're charged with performing. But in fact, we are an agency of only 3,700 people, charged with overseeing more than 30,000 entities, with policy responsibilities ranging from market structure to accounting standards, to corporate disclosure, to small business capital formation. We're an agency whose staff size and investments in new technology are less than what they were in 2005. What's more, we're an agency that is subject to the annual appropriations process. So over the past 10 years, we've seen large ups and downs in our budget, making it difficult to do long-term planning or develop adequate technology. In my view, it is truly critical that if the SEC is to become the kind of regulatory agency that the American people have a right to expect, we must have sufficient, stable, long-term funding. And that's why it is so important for Congress to address the issue of self-funding, allowing the SEC to retain the regulatory fees it collects. In fact, the amount of fees we collect is far more than the amount we are currently given to operate. And virtually every other financial regulator is self-funded, which gives them the flexibility to respond to market events through increased staffing and technology developments. Like them, the SEC should be self-funded. But if we cannot get what we need, or if something doesn't go quite the way we expect, my next lesson is to take the long view. Perseverance pays off. There may be many ups and downs in any given job, but the mission is bigger than the events of any one day. The end zone is not the next media cycle. If you're constantly worried over what someone will say about you tomorrow, you are probably not doing the right thing today. At the SEC, we know we are under a very intense spotlight. We recognize that. We get criticized for bringing cases. We get criticized for not bringing cases. When we settle a case, people ask, why not for more? When we bring a case, people ask, why not sooner? Sometimes we lose a case. Sometimes we don't get the legislation we hope for. But I think we need to just keep doing the job that we're tasked to do, realizing that in the long run, if we do not waver in our commitment to protecting investors, we will get it mostly right. Indeed, I'm confident that in a few years, we will be able to look back at an agency that helped to restore investor confidence, that restructured key divisions, that changed a formerly insular culture, that passed rules giving shareholders a better chance to vote for directors of the companies they own, that enhanced the amount of information contained in proxies, that shed light on the dark spots within our markets, and that closed loopholes that contributed to the financial crisis. But knowing your goal is also crucial, because you can have all the perseverance in the world and all the determination and drive, but if you don't know where you're headed, it will be very difficult to get there. That's why another lesson I have learned is to have a vision about where you want to take your organization and stick to your principles in getting there. Principles are not ideologies, they are different. Maybe it's a question of degree, maybe to some it's semantics. But as I see it, unlike ideologies, principles don't seem to demand a particular answer to every problem that emerges. We've seen how strict adherence to ideology played out over the last decade in the financial arena. Free market ideology, together with rapidly changing technology, globalization, and many other accidental causes, led too many of us to forget hard-learned lessons from past crises and abandon basic common sense. Principles, on the other hand, help frame a question, an issue, or a problem. Having a principle might highlight tensions and trade-offs of particular choices, but rarely do they force you to choose between a good solution and a worldview. For me at the SEC, my main principle is putting investors first, and I try to stay focused on that every day. And the goal is to build an SEC that is deeply expert, nimble, and aggressive, and that gives investors confidence. In fact, as Bob can attest, I have a sign posted on my door that says, "How does it help investors?" It's a simple question, but it guides all that I do at the SEC. And all those who enter my office understand that is the prism through which we will consider all issues. It doesn't necessarily dictate the outcome of every issue that lands on my desk, because there are many solutions to any problem that could aid investors. But the principle helps to shape our thinking and steers us in the right path. At the SEC, over the past 9 months, this principle has steered us to propose new rules that would improve corporate governance and enhance the type of information disclosed to investors about governance, risk, and compensation. It has steered us to propose new rules that would make money market funds more resilient. It has steered us to propose new rules that would shed light in the dark corners and level the playing field for all investors in the market. And it has steered us to propose new rules to eliminate the corrupting influence of political contributions in the management of public pension funds. Indeed, I like to believe that one of our successes has been to refocus the SEC on this principle. Another important lesson that certainly applies to the governmental arena is to know how to communicate. Given our system of separation of powers and checks and balances, any sustained, meaningful change requires buy-in from others. It's hard to get buy-in without being able to explain your position clearly and concisely. If an idea can't be described, it's very hard to get it adopted. And you think about your favorite professor. He or she likely is the one who captured your imagination by clearly laying out the lecture and knowing how to speak to you directly. It probably wasn't the one who spoke in lofty phrases and an overly pedantic manner that you could barely follow and hardly grasp. And in the real world, the same is true. I could have the brightest minds in the agency and some of the best ideas to offer, but if I cannot explain those ideas to lawmakers, to investors, or taxpayers, it will only be an idea, never a policy. So know what you want to say and say it clearly. Which brings me to my next point. Beware of the unintended consequences of genius. There are many people out there who are sheer geniuses. They have a wonderful ability to stretch people's thinking, shake up an organization, and shape new and better ideas. That being said, because ideas matter, geniuses are just part of the equation. The unintended consequence of genius develops not from the genius directly, but from others who can sometimes stop questioning and just start trusting. It's rational to say, heck, he's a genius. He knows what he's talking about, and I really don't want to look foolish by asking a silly question. That's bad. It's bad for the team that now loses other perspectives and inputs. It's bad for the genius who stops questioning himself, and it's really bad for policy. Part of me thinks this is how plain vanilla mortgages turned into mortgage-backed securities, that turned into collateralized debt obligations, that turned into CDOs squared. This happened with a whole host of financial products and activities that people didn't fully understand but bought or transacted anyway. So think about it. The financial system was brought down to its knees by products, activities, and actions that only a genius could love. Of course, it may be that they really never were geniuses in the first place. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a genius. I hope you all are. But don't let others around you cower in your presence because you sound so smart about a topic. In the end, you may be wrong. Finally, and perhaps most important, attitudes matter. There are many different paths to success in policy. There's luck, hard work, pure talent, good judgment and experience, and like you, most have some mixture of these. But the one secret weapon in this field is decency and humanity. I really mean this, and I know this is a very cynical time, but I've seen a lot of talented people left behind because of attitude. Not all, but a lot. I've also seen a lot of good, honest people who got a seat at the small table, taking full advantage of that opportunity and ultimately having a huge impact. So these are just some of the lessons I've learned and that guide me, some that I've latched onto throughout my life. But like you, I continue to learn new ones as time goes by. And that's because we don't stop learning important lessons when we graduate from an institution of higher education. We always continue to learn. And at the SEC, we will also continue to learn, to continue to do what we're tasked to do, to continue to protect investors, and to continue to work to restore investor confidence. Thank you all so much.
Mary, let me start by thanking you for giving the speech you gave, and not a speech about some narrow new initiative on managing naked short sales.
Although that sounds kind of good.
Yeah, thank you for not. What you did do is share how you are trying to manage an extraordinarily complex institution. And to do that well takes wisdom. And what you've accumulated through your long experience is wisdom. And thank you for sharing that wisdom with the people here. I know they have a lot of questions to ask. I want to start, though, and preempt by asking the first one. As you talk about how you're managing the SEC, many of us who have had the experience of dealing with the SEC, including yourself, because when you weren't running it or being a commissioner, you were dealing with it, realizes that it's composed of divisions and that, like many big institutions, those divisions oftentimes operate separately from each other. And it's not unusual. Big institutions have pieces that just silo themselves off. Wonder what you're doing, if you agree that that's a challenge, what you're doing to try and get better communications among those divisions.
Thank you, Bob. That's a great question because it is an issue throughout the government, and certainly it's been an issue for the SEC. And we do operate in divisions with people who are highly expert in particular areas. Investment management worries about investment companies, mutual funds, and money market funds. And trading and markets worries about broker-dealer regulation and market structure questions. And corporation finance worries about public disclosure, accounting, and standards. And then we have many other functions, of course. So we've tried to take a couple of different approaches. First of all, I've had almost all new senior staff at the agency in the last 9 months. There were a number of vacancies when I arrived, and a number of people have left since. So as I've recruited new senior leadership, teamwork and collaboration have been very high on my list of attributes that people must have in order to join the team. Secondly, in order to break down some of the barriers, we've created more cross-agency task forces and work efforts. So, for example, we're very interested in a product called life settlements, where people are convinced to senior citizens generally sell their life insurance policy for more than the surrender value but less than the face value. Those life policies can then be pooled together and securitized, and the securities sold to the public. And there are lots of issues about this. They range from privacy issues for the person who has sold their life insurance and now has a complete stranger monitoring their health, to the whole securitization process and the issues that we're familiar with from the mortgage crisis. So we've got people across the agency working on that issue. We've done the same thing with respect to trying to develop a more effective audit trail so that we can understand the impact, for example, of hedge funds and other large traders in our market. Again, cross-agency task forces. So by pushing people together to work collaboratively to make each one's success depend on the success of their colleagues, I think we're slowly bringing the agency back to think about, for people to think about themselves as we the SEC, not we the Division of Investment Management or we the Division of Enforcement. And that's a cultural change, and it's one we work on every single day, but it's critical that we have a sense that we are all in this together at the SEC.
Thank you. Okay, with that, let me throw the Microphone's open. The rules, I think those of you who are frequent attendees know. Please identify yourself and actually ask a question. And try to keep it within limits.
Good evening, Chairman Shapiro. Thank you so much for coming to Harvard. I'm a graduate student in nonprofit management at the university. And my question has to do with proxy voting and the differences between individual investors and how they proxy vote and institutional investors and how they conduct their proxy voting. There's many systems and companies like Riskmetrics and others that offer proxy voting services to institutional investors to help them automate and think strategically about their choices on those ballots. But there's really no system or no approach for individual investors to gain knowledge and information and actually automate their own preferences on ballots, because it's obviously incredibly time-consuming if you receive dozens of ballots to sort through all that and make sense of it. I'm wondering if the SEC is looking into ways to streamline that and offer opportunities for individual investors to engage more fruitfully in these kind of votes.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question because it gave me a chance to introduce Lori Schock, who's the new head of investor education at the SEC. And we're going to do something a little different with Lori's office for exactly the reasons that you just listed. We need to be at the forefront of investor education, helping Americans achieve a level of financial literacy. We've never tackled shareholder education. And because of the advent of a rule of the New York Stock Exchange that the SEC approved in the last year called Rule 452, you don't need to know the number, but it basically says brokers can no longer vote on behalf of their customers for board elections, those can't be uninstructed votes by brokers. So now, in order to make sure we have quorums at annual meetings and that companies with broad retail investor bases get the proxy votes they need, we really have to educate shareholders about what the proxy is, why it matters, and why it's really critical that they take the time and effort to vote. Coupled with that, we've seen, as a result of the SEC allowing notice and access to proxy materials, a notice goes out and then you're told to go to the website. We've seen a not insignificant drop in retail shareholder voting. So we have two issues coming together in particular this year that would make it really critical for us to have a very aggressive program of shareholder education. And Lori's just joined us. We're actually going to have a deputy in her office solely devoted to this initiative, who has tremendous experience with institutional shareholders. And we'll make a tremendous effort in this area because it is very important. And as we expand access to the proxy, we have greater opportunity in the future perhaps for contested elections, all the more important that retail shareholders vote. The last thing I'll say on that is that proxy advisory firms, we have launched an initiative to really look at all the mechanics of the proxy voting process, including how proxy advisory firms are operating, the quality of the disclosure they give about potential conflicts that they may have in advising their institutional clients.
Hi, my name is Andrew Vello. I'm an undergraduate at the college. Thank you for coming here, Ms. Shapiro.
Thank you.
My question is, I'd just like to have your thoughts on creating new regulations that seek to curb executive compensation. What your thoughts are on that?
Well, you know, the SEC is a disclosure agency, and we've never set out to set limits on compensation. We have proposed rules that I hope we'll finalize before long that would require much more disclosure, again, for shareholders to vote when they're voting, to understand when they're voting proxies for directors, to give much more disclosure about how a company thinks about risk and compensation, and what kinds of compensation programs might be incentivizing risk-taking, so that shareholders can understand that, and so the compensation committees of boards can think those issues through more carefully. So we have those rule proposals out. In addition, the Fed has proposed rules just in the last 2 weeks that would relate to compensation practices at banking institutions with a focus on whether compensation threatens the safety and soundness of those institutions. And the final piece is that we'll do rules very shortly that will require any banking institution that has been a recipient of TARP funds to permit an advisory vote on pay practices at the firm. There's also been legislation introduced to allow, they call it say-on-pay advisory votes broadly for all public companies, but it's in effect now under statute for TARP recipients, and we'll do final regulations in the next couple of months on that. So we've always taken a disclosure-based approach, but the bank regulators, the prudential regulators are taking a more aggressive and more hands-on approach. The only other thing I'd say about this is traditionally compensation disclosure has focused on the top 5 executive officers of a company. What we're looking for in our new disclosure is something much broader that goes much more to the compensation structure of the institution. So hopefully gives a bit more insight to investors about how the board's handling compensation.
Good evening, Jeb Broding. Thank you for coming, Chairman. I mean, just coming back to your point about trust in the financial system, because I think we've had a real jolt of confidence and trust the last couple of years. My understanding is that 85% of the mutual funds over the last 20 years have substantially underperformed indices, effectively monkeys who could have thrown darts, and we've seen this sort of dramatic privatization of gains by executives in Wall Street, but then when there was a loss, the government had to use taxpayers' money to bail them out, largely through a lot of products that were sold through the securities markets with AAA ratings. I know you're very good at sort of regulating sort of details and procedures and that sort of thing, but I'm just wondering, at some point, is there a kind of a moral issue where the abuses just get so large that maybe you, and I know you don't want to meddle into markets, but is there some point where you just have to say, what can we do to restore confidence and trust as opposed to procedures?
I think there are a lot of moral issues actually in our markets right now, and you've laid out some of them. One of the reasons I feel strongly as I do about corporate governance is that the responsibility for overseeing the management of companies, the risks that they're taking, the compensation practices that they're permitting, is the responsibility of boards of directors. And I think holding boards accountable through a genuine shareholder election process can be one of the most meaningful things we can do to help restore confidence in the integrity of not just financial institutions, but generally. And it's one reason I'm so committed to our moving forward, whether we've got it exactly right in what we've proposed for proxy access, open to debate and open to fair debate. But I think it's why, to my mind, it is so important that there be a mechanism in place to hold boards of directors accountable in the oversight and the management of corporations, and I think that's one of the most effective ways to get there. That said, I think as we see this legislative process play out on Capitol Hill, we continue to see areas where there will be profound differences in business going forward. If I can give you an example of over-the-counter derivatives, a hugely unregulated, enormous market that has played a very significant role in the financial crisis, but as a result of legislation 2000 was exempted from virtually all regulation. Those markets are coming under regulation. The dealers who sell over-the-counter derivatives will be regulated, will have capital, will have risk management, will have oversight, will be subject to enforcement. Those contracts will largely be cleared through central clearing parties, which will remove a huge element of risk in the system, and they are likely to also be traded on exchanges. So there will be tremendous transparency and ability for the public and regulators to see what's happening in a very large swath of the financial markets. So I appreciate your comments, but I think we will see fairly dramatic change over the next year in how both corporations are run and how Wall Street in particular is run.
My name's Andrew Knipe. I'm a student here. I wanted to ask a question more about your talk, which was actually sort of generic lessons for policymakers and policy managers. And my question is this: how did you turn around the morale of the more junior staff, so those who haven't, the positions that weren't vacant, or those who haven't left since you started? How did you turn around a group that I guess would have felt quite battered without sort of blaming them?
Well, first of all, I won't take any credit for turning around morale. I mean, we have a long way to go. But what I think I found when I got to the agency was that people were anxious to do their jobs. A lot of process had been layered over, particularly in the enforcement division, and let me speak about that specifically. They couldn't take testimony or subpoena documents from targets that they were investigating without getting 5 commissioners to sit in a meeting and authorize them to do that. So it could take weeks or months in order to actually get an investigation commenced. We took away all that process and we put it back in the hands of people who are on the front lines. Similarly, they couldn't settle a case with a corporation where the corporation was going to pay a penalty without having pre-consulted before they could even go to the corporation and talk about the sanction. We took away all of that process so we could speed it up. We could get people out in the field, doing cases, doing investigations much more quickly. And the sort of the view within the building became enforcement is what we're supposed to be doing, and it's an important part of what we do, and it's looked upon very favorably by the leadership of the agency. And bringing in new leadership throughout the agency helps that as well. So I won't claim that we've turned morale around. Lots of change going on at the SEC, and change is always hard for people. But I sense genuine enthusiasm and excitement for the mission, for our refocusing on investor protection, for our refocusing on market structure and market integrity concerns. And people went there to do those things. So to the extent it was hard to get them done over the last few years, there was frustration. To the extent it's a lot easier to get some of those things done now, I think there's enthusiasm.
Hi, my name is Bill Workmeister. I'm a mid-career student here, and I'm also, I guess, a former investment banker in the structured finance division at Citigroup, Solomon Smith Party. I know. I have, I guess, a question related to your genius comments and also your, I guess, communication comments within the SEC. But I guess I had the good fortune. I wasn't one of the geniuses, but I had a good fortune to work with a number of them. And you know, they were MIT PhDs and Harvard PhDs working on Monte Carlo simulations of our bond models. But I think there was really kind of a disconnect maybe between public policy and these guys that were in the back room structuring our bonds with the introduction of you know, the home ownership plan in the 1990s by the Clinton administration, the introduction of no-doc loans, and the subsequent, you know, fraud that happened in the mortgage market at the origination level. So, you know, we would see misreported appraisals and LTVs. We would see misreported incomes. And for years, for 30 or 40 years, the structured finance guys did a great job of taking the information that they had and understanding the risk level of bonds. Then all of a sudden, they were getting information that they claimed wasn't accurate. I think everyone bears responsibility. The underwriters bear responsibility, but also perhaps the mortgage brokers and the originators. Do you think there's something that perhaps can be done on the communication level, not within the SEC, but perhaps all the way along the regulatory lines from the mortgage brokers, regulators to, you know, banks that are now moving securities off their balance sheet to the investment banks, kind of in a regulatory fashion to increase communication all the way along this complex system versus just, you know, at the underwriting level?
I don't know about the communication piece of it so much, but I completely agree with the point that everybody needs to take the broader view. And the idea that, we wrote a lot of loans, but we got them off our books, so now there's somebody else's problems because we securitized, it was really poisonous in our system. And of course, we didn't disperse risk that way, we just concentrated it differently, and I think there was a real lack of understanding. I really think it's important for Wall Street firms to make sure that their people understand that all these dots connect at some point, and nobody is operating in a silo or in a vacuum. And what happens in trading or what happens in investment banking or what happens in structured products broadly affects the entire institution, as we've seen at a number of firms, and broadly affects the financial system. And I hope those are lessons that have been learned this time around, and you have to hope they're lessons that won't be forgotten either, because I think they're really critical.
Yeah, my name is Emmanuel Hooper. I do research at Harvard. My interest is in the regulations and effective regulations. We're listening to the new effective regulations supposedly coming into place very shortly to deregulate, hopefully, the complex derivatives and short-term borrowing and things like that. I mean, to perhaps bring back the Glass-Steagall Act. But there's some challenges here, and the question is whether this is repeated 15 years from now or 50 years from now. My question to you is, how resilient is the SEC going to be to conflict of interest, such as pressure from Wall Street with a lot of lobbyists in Washington to try to stop you from changing or making tough regulations? Things like when you hire people who have expertise, knowledge, who come from Wall Street background and have knowledge of hedge funds and so forth, how are you able to withstand internal conflict of interest and to really not become subservient to Wall Street, but actually enforce it to the point where you have strong regulations enforced and also public confidence?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. We have been criticized for not having cutting-edge expertise and really understanding either product strategies or how the street works. And we have to bring that talent into the SEC. And does that bring with it some risk of conflict? Yeah, sure, it does. We have lots of ways to guard against that. My experience, however, has been that the people who join us from Wall Street, and this was true at the NASD and it was true at the CFTC when I was there, become among the most zealous advocates of the public interest. And there is something that happens when you come into government, and that doesn't happen with every single person. But again, my experience has been that people come in, they will come to do the job. They don't come to government if they're not willing to put that hat on and say, I represent the public interest now, and I'll bring my experience, and I'll bring my expertise, and my talent, and my skills, but I'm here for something different. And so it doesn't work perfectly all the time. In general, it seems to work pretty well.
Hi, my name is Carolina Haidia, and I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. My question goes to the idea of players. You had mentioned that there are many, and one of the roles I see for evaluating risk is that of the rating agencies. However, rating agencies don't seem to have anyone rating, evaluating, or holding them accountable. So I guess my question goes to the future role of oversight of rating agencies. How important do you think it is, and what can we do about it?
You know, this is a debate. It's a debate broadly in the country. It's a debate within Washington, and it's a debate right within the SEC. We talk all the time. We actually took some steps to minimize in SEC rules and regulations the use of ratings. There were some rules that there are many rules that actually require companies to hold certain rated instruments, for example, in money market funds or in other pooled investments, or for net capital purposes to have certain rated securities. And our view was that we need to start to wean people off of this reliance on ratings as being the answer or the excuse to not do their own due diligence. And so we've taken ratings out of a few of our rules, and we're going to continue looking at that and continuing down that path. And we've done some rules on rating agencies to try to illuminate the problem of ratings shopping, where a company structures a product, they send out the preliminary information to 3 rating agencies, and the one that gives them the best preliminary rating, lo and behold, is the one that rates the product that's used, and that rating is then used to sell it. So we're proposed rules to require significant disclosure of all preliminary ratings so the public can see. And we're pushing in that direction. There's also legislation in both houses of Congress that would tighten up the regulation of rating agencies, as well as make them subject to liability, which they have not been historically. And we've actually proposed that as well. And that may have the most important effect in terms of disciplining what they do and how they do their ratings. But I think the real answer is for the Fed, the Treasury, the FDIC, the other agencies that incorporate ratings into their regulatory regimes to start to pull away from that. And that's my hope that will happen. The other thing that's happened that's interesting is that we've spent a lot of time on this issue. We've really encouraged people to come to us with some different models for rating. You know, there's the 3 largest rating agencies are issuer-paid models. The issuer of the securities pays for the rating. Lots of conflict there. There are also some smaller agencies that have a subscriber pays model, where if I want the rating, I pay for it, but I'm not the issuer of the securities. And we've thought about, is there a utility model? Could large institutional investors join together and create a buyer-owned or an institution-owned rating agencies? And we really tried to encourage some different ways of thinking about how to structure rating agencies to diminish the conflicts of interest. And I'm hopeful that some creative people will come back to us and ask us to allow them to go forward with a new business model, because we'd be very open to that.
My name is Ali Maki, and I'm an alumnus of the Kennedy School. My first question is, it's a 2-part question. The first part is, managing a regulatory agency like yours, there's a proliferation of new regulations and enforcement actions and a lot of activity. right after some crash or a Bernie Madoff doesn't make it. But when things are exuberant, regulatory bodies are usually very reluctant to act. The Fed is supposed to take the punch bowl right when the party gets going, but regulatory agencies are just afraid to act when the market keeps going up, and everybody's house prices are doubling, and everybody seems to be making money. And so, what do you build in as a culture in a regulatory body to give them the confidence to act when everybody's doing great and nobody wants to take the punch bowl? And the second part that I would like to ask is, can the SEC act against financial products where the risks are socialized, but the benefits are privatized? If there's a financial product of that nature, can the SEC move in and do something about that?
Well, on your first question, which is a great question, and it's sort of almost the history of financial regulation in some ways, I think what you build in, it has to become part of the culture of the agency, and that's why, for me, it's so important to repeat every single day, we're here to serve investors. So the markets may be going up. The market went way up today, and financial institutions may be getting their feet back on the ground, and housing prices may start to increase. That's when regulators actually need to be the most skeptical about what's happening. It's the old, fix the roof while the sun is shining kind of a concept. We have to be skeptical, and we have to be willing to act year in and year out, regardless of what's actually happening in the markets. And of course, when there's a crisis, we will respond, I hope, always, as quickly and as comprehensively as we can, which is why you're seeing so many regulations being proposed right now. We have a lot to make up for that, frankly, wasn't happening over the last several years. But I can also tell you, uniquely from the SEC experience, I served at the agency 20 years ago as a commissioner. I served under three very different chairmen, David Reuter, Richard Breeden, and Arthur Levitt. We weren't really we dealt a little bit with, obviously, the market break in '87 during that period, but for much of that time I was there, we weren't really facing any crises, yet the agency brought great cases, it wrote important rules, it was sensitive to competitiveness issues and things like that, but it was a steady contributor to the integrity of the financial system during that period. And there's no reason why we can't be exactly that again, and we should be that again. So I think if we can inculcate so deeply into our culture that it's about the investors. It's not about whether markets are going up, and it's not about whether banks are making a lot of money. It's about whether investors are being treated fairly, whether they're being offered products that put their interests first, whether their relationship with their broker is an honest one. Then we won't have these great periods of volatility and regulation. We'll be much more of a steady state operator. I think the idea that the upside is individual and the downside is mutualized, I think is a really serious question. And this new division we've created, one of its core functions is actually product analysis. And we want to understand, particularly in the retirement market where we're seeing a plethora of new products being created, some with very high fee structures and some with very questionable results at the end of the day for retirees. But we want this new division to be really focused on understanding, taking apart, and testing products through all kinds of economic cycles so that we can step in and at a minimum warn people about some of the things that are being offered and perhaps take even more aggressive action.
Thank you very much for coming here. My name is Irv Plotkin. I'm kind of an interloper from the technology place down the river. I'd like to pick up on two themes that you said. One, the historic, and one primary object of the SEC, stockholder disclosure, and the need, as you say, to explain in clear, concise language, not genius language, to policymakers and the body politic. Keeping those two in mind, could you explain to this body what your or the administration's attorneys could not explain satisfactorily to the judge, how, if you believe the Bank of America had not adequately disclosed the facts and circumstances of the Merrill Lynch purchase to its stockholders, you could agree to a settlement of what was characterized as a relatively trivial amount of dollars, not compared to my annual salary, but certainly compared to the wherewithal of the bank, and bring no individual actions against those who had to have perpetrated that deception of the investors.
Well, let me be careful how I respond to this, because we're obviously deeply into litigation with Merrill Lynch. The judge did not concur with our settlement, and so we're deep in litigation with Bank of America as a result of the acquisition of Merrill Lynch. And so now we're going to litigate that case. There's a case management plan publicly available. There's a trial date set, and we're proceeding. And as a result of these cases going forward, we now have much greater ability to question individuals and pursue potentially broader charges with respect to Bank of America. So without obviously getting into the details and jeopardizing anything that's going on in the litigation scheme, we're pursuing that matter aggressively.
No, but my question was, how do you justify the settlement that you had put forward, given what you believe to be the facts, not what you're going to do
Based on the
now?
facts we had at that time and the investigation that was conducted, we believe that the case and the settlement sent a very strong message of corporate deterrence about the importance of full and complete disclosure contained within the proxy, as opposed to in multiple pieces of information available, or in some cases not totally available, in other places. That message of corporate deterrence, a message about the importance of that particular rule that we allege to have been violated, we thought it was a fair settlement. Let's not conflate that with the broader issues. We're talking about one issue, proxy disclosure with respect to bonuses. Let's not conflate that with an ongoing investigation of broader issues with respect to the Merrill Lynch acquisition by Bank of America.
Hi. Chairman Shapiro, thank you so much for joining us today. Last month in this room, Chairman Volcker came and spoke to us, and he spoke at length about the overrepresentation of the financial sector as a portion of our economy, and the fact that so many of the geniuses of my generation were going into that sector. Given your long history in the financial sector, both as a regulator and elsewhere, I was wondering if you could speak to the growth of the financial sector over the last 30 years and what that might mean for the global competitiveness of our economy.
Well, it's a great question, and I've been almost exclusively a regulator for my entire career, with a very brief, very early on stint at a trade association. So I would love to see many more of your contemporaries come into government and intersect with the financial sector through the public policy and enforcement mechanism that the government provides, because I think we need talented, hardworking, committed people in government every bit as much as the financial firms need people. I think there has been, in part because of the distortion of compensation, and for probably a variety of other reasons, a huge flow of people into financial services firms, and that is what it is. But I'm hoping that we're reaching a better balance right now, where people with MBAs and other advanced degrees are willing to maybe try some other things other than just going into investment banking. And I really would encourage government as one of those opportunities.
My job is to keep the trains running on time, and I've been told I'm supposed to adjourn this at this time. So with that, Mary, thank you so much for honoring us by coming.
Thank you.